I always say that you win your fantasy football leagues with good in-season moves. But to lay the foundations for that, you should probably draft well. Hit that like button because we're going to be talking about some draft strategies so when you're on the clock this season, you don't take a giant Hey, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle coming to you from the Draft.com studios with another episode of the Fantasy Headliners, talking about draft day strategies with you for the 2019 season. But before we jump into the information, I've got to tell you, our draft guide is straight fire. Take a look for yourself. Make sure you get yours at thefantasyheadliners.com, only $19.99. I promise it's going to be one of the best investments that you make all season long. Let's start jumping into this right now because we've got a lot to talk about. We want to keep this episode as short as possible because no worries, you've got a lot to do. So we want to make sure we get as much information to you as quickly as possible. So number one, the first strategy, the first thing that I always tell fantasy owners is to establish some sort of game plan prior to your draft. Now, you always need to be flexible, 100%. Be flexible, go with the flow of the draft. As certain things happen, you have to be able to change your game plan. But going into it, establish some sort of a game plan, whether you want to be balanced. Do you want to go running back, wide receiver, running back, wide receiver? Do you want to make sure you get a tight end in there somewhere? Do you want to do heavy running back? Do you want to do a running back in the first 2 rounds? Do you want to do heavy wide receiver? Go wide receiver in the first 2 rounds, a zero running back or a zero wide receiver approach. Take a look at all of those things. I'm going to be talking about ADP here in a minute, but check ADP websites. Lay out some ground rules for you. This guy here, this guy here. Do some mock drafts over on Fantasy Football Calculator. One of our partners here at the Fantasy Headliners. Use their draft simulator. It's a great tool. It's a lot better than doing just a regular mock draft because they have a lot of different behind-the-scenes calculations to help it feel like an actual draft instead of people who are just jumping in and timing out. So always do those things. Get prepared. Get set up. Ready to go. So then you can see how different things play out, but you can have some sort of a game plan in mind going into it. You know where certain players may or may not fall. You know where you would like to take certain players, and then you can kind of go from there. With that being said, don't rely on ADP, okay? Don't just sit there and say, oh, this guy has got a 4th round ADP. That's where I'm going to try and take him. Because to build off of that, always get your guys. If you believe in somebody and you really want that player and you want him on your team and you think he's going to have a great season, then go get him. Throw ADP out the window. It doesn't matter when someone thinks that you took him at the right spot or not, or if you got right value or not. If you feel like you need to jump on someone to take them then and get them because they might be gone later, then do it and don't look back. Doing a draft right now for the Scott Fish Bowl. If you don't know what that is, check us out on Twitter. Everyone's tweeting about it right now. It's the world's largest fantasy football league, over 1,200 people in it. But one of my guys was Dalvin Cook. And even though in this format, because it's super flex and there's a lot of other different weird scoring categories, Dalvin Cook is more like an end of the second, early 3rd round pick. But because I had a late first pick, picking at the 1.09, I knew I had to take him early in the second or I might not get him. So I jumped early because I'm expecting a huge Dalvin Cook year. You need to do the same thing. So with all that being said, again, game plan beforehand. Look at ADP. Use it as a part of your formula and what you want to do, but don't rely on it too much because in the end, you need to go get your guys. All right, let's talk about the first couple of rounds here of your draft, what you might be able to expect and what you should be looking to do. And if you have a top 4 pick, it's easy. We know who we're going to get, right? We've got Barkley up there. We've got Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey. We have Alvin Kamara. Those 4 guys are definitely going to go in that top 4. Then you have David Johnson, who's kind of sneaking in there, and Melvin Gordon, who's sneaking in there as well. Those guys probably won't go top 4, but they're going to go in the first round. And then in between that, you're having Devontae Adams and DeAndre Hopkins. So that's really what your first 6, 8, 10 picks are going to look like. And then the back half of the first round, if you're playing in a 12 or 14 or 16 team league, there's going to be a mixture of guys, talking in a sense of typically a 12-team league is kind of your standard size. If you're playing in a 12-team league, then at the end of the first round, you could see guys like a Michael Thomas show up, maybe a Dalvin Cook like I just talked about a minute ago. Maybe he shows up at the end of the round there. Julio Jones is going to pop up too. So the end of the first is a little bit of a crapshoot. So at the beginning of the draft, definitely those top 4 running backs, and then we're looking at Adams and Hopkins, then David Johnson and Melvin Gordon, and then at that point, best available. Who's going to be sitting there? Does someone fall to you? Are you going to, if you're going to be doing a running back heavy approach, do you take a guy like Dalvin Cook or James Conner? If you're going to do a wide receiver heavy approach, do you go with Julio Jones? So those are kind of the steps there in the first round. Now in the second round, and this is what I am 100% going to do in basically all my drafts this year, unless it plays out differently. And again, that's where you go with the flow. I'm going to be going running back heavy, probably a running back in the first and the second round, because there is so much potential, so much value with wide receivers this year. It's absolutely crazy because you can go first 2 rounds, you can go with guys like a Dalvin Cook and a Nick Chubb. You can go with guys like at the top of the first. If you want someone like that, you could go Todd Gurley at the end of the second, James Conner, Joe Mixon, Damian Williams, Le'Veon Bell, all of these running backs, these dual threat running backs, guys that are going to get you yards in the air and on the ground. All these guys are saturating the first 2 rounds this year. Travis Kelce, you're going to throw him in there in the second round, and it's pushing a lot of wide receiver talent back to the third round right now. In the third round, you could potentially get guys like Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, T.Y. Hilton, Keenan Allen, Adam Thielen, A.J. Green, Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs. All these guys you're getting third and fourth round value on, and that is why I personally am leaning running back heavy this year. Get me my workhorse running backs. Get me the running backs at the first 2 rounds that are going to offer me the most upside. After I get those guys in the third and fourth round, you could get guys that are going to still be wide receiver 1 type players. Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, Stephon Diggs, all those guys to me are wide receiver 1s this year. 100%. All those guys I'm going to have up near wide receiver 1 or in wide receiver 1. At worst case scenario, a high wide receiver 2. But then at that point, in round 3 and 4, you're drafting 2 high wide receiver 2 type players. So that's my recommendation for you to this year is to hit those top running backs, those heavy running backs, those guys with the biggest upside early, and then get a ton of value in the third and fourth round with your wide receivers. Because if you're able to do that and stay slightly balanced with 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, you're already off to an amazing start. All right, now we're making it out of those first few rounds, and we're getting into 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in those areas. And what I like to do in this area is I like to focus when I'm focusing on like my running back 3 or my wide receiver 3 or my flex guys. If you play in a half PPR or a PPR league, you really should hone on the volume type guys that are going to get you a lot of catches. Take advantage of as many of those reception points as you can possibly get. Now, if you play in a standard league, you might be looking at more like, you might be shooting for those guys that are going to be running backs that are going to get the rock, like a Sonny Michel is a guy that you might take a chance on in a standard league. In a PPR or half PPR league, I'm probably going to leave him alone this year. So what are some value guys that you can get that are going to be those ones that are going to offer you a tremendous amount of possible receptions? Well, let's name a few of them right now. So put them up on the screen there for you. Wide receivers, I'm targeting Robert Woods. He's not going to have a ton of upside, but he's going to get a ton of volume. Cooper Kupp, he's not going to be healthy until the middle of the season, fully healthy until the middle of the season. It's going to take some time for him to come back. Brandon Cooks is the big play guy. Robert Woods is going to be your steady, reliable receiver. But Jarvis Landry, Larry Fitzgerald, Kiki Cutie, Golden Tate, Anthony Miller, Deshaun Hamilton, Adam Humphries. Those are all guys that I see with a lot of PPR upside, half PPR upside, because there are guys that I could possibly seeing get enough volume, enough targets this year that if you put them at wide receiver 3 or flex, you're going to just get those little extra points that can help you win a week. Now for running backs, let's take a look at running backs that can help you in those half PPR leagues. A guy like Phillip Lindsay, Kenyon Drake, Tarek Cohen, James White, Tevin Coleman, Jerick McKinnon, if you want to be that risky, one of those guys are going to get a decent amount of receptions this year. Miles Sanders, I expect to be a high impact guy in the passing game. Austin Eckler is more of just a Melvin Gordon handcuff for me. He's not a guy that I might just draft for standalone value alone. He did really well to start last year, but he didn't finish that well. Jalen Samuels, Nyheim Hines, and a lot of people are forgetting about Chris Thompson right now because of how well, or, I don't want to say how well because there's a lot of people that don't think he played that well, but Adrian Peterson played pretty well last year. And then of course you've got Darius Geis coming off the ACL. He's going to offer you some upside this year. He might end up taking the job from Adrian Peterson, but I don't see Adrian Peterson going to the bench anytime soon either. So Chris Thompson's another guy that's kind of getting lost in the fold because he's that true PPR receiving back. He's not going to get a ton of carries, but he's going to get work. He's going to get work in the passing game. And I could see that happening for him this year as well. So those are all guys to take a target at. Remember, when you start getting into those later rounds, you want to be drafting guys that they're not going to be fantasy studs. Everybody wants to find that big fantasy stud, obviously, that pops out of nowhere in those middle rounds and becomes a top wide receiver, a top running back. That's fine if you want to go that route, but I want to be safe. I want guys that are going to get me points, even if they're just a few points here and there from receptions. If a guy like Miles Sanders, only has 50 receiving yards in a game, but he's got 3 receptions, that's 3 extra points. That could be 8 total points right there, depending on the settings of your league. Maybe he finds the end zone with one of those 2, gets you another 6 points as well. So, in those weeks where I need help on the buys or injuries, or I'm just looking for a decent flex play that week because I don't have all those high upside guys, get some guys that are going to be safe and they're going to offer you those points. So that when you put them in your lineup, you're just not going to get a dud every week. All right, so next question, next draft strategy. When are we drafting quarterbacks and tight ends? Let's talk about quarterbacks first. If you're a fan of the show, if you've been around, you know that I'm a big proponent of the late round quarterback strategy. And let me throw some information up here for you. You may have heard me mention this in another video, but I think this is really good information for you to take in regarding quarterbacks. So I put a little thread on Twitter not too long ago, basically breaking down some of the quarterback value. So since 2012, there's only been 5 quarterbacks that have had back-to-back top 5 finishes in fantasy football. Breeze in 12 and 13, Newton in 12 and 13, Luck in 13 and 14, Manning, not Eli, Peyton Manning, and 13 and 14, Wilson in 14 and 15. It's been 3 seasons since we've had a quarterback that has finished in the top 5 in back-to-back years. So last season's top 5, Mahomes, Ryan, Roethlisberger, Watson, and Luck. Watson and Luck, I do think, and Mahomes are all guys that could finish within the top 5. Roethlisberger, I don't think so. Ryan could fall a little bit down. I still like him. What 5 quarterbacks led the way in 2018 ADP? Rodgers, Watson, Brady, Wilson, and Breeze. So Watson was the only guy drafted in the top 5 quarterbacks last season that actually finished as the top 5 quarterback. He finished as the QB4. So here's the really important thing, though, and this is what I want everyone to keep an eye on here. In terms of fantasy points per game in 2018, only 2 points per game separated the quarterback 5 from the quarterback 12, and only 1.1 points separated the QB 12 from the QB 20. So the current top 5 in quarterback ADP is Mahomes, Luck, Rodgers, Watson, Mayfield. That's been shifting quite a bit recently, but that's what we've been looking at quite often. So in 2019, this is probably going to be the deepest that we've ever seen the quarterback position, and that's why I'm personally running with a late round QB strategy. Even like in a super flex league or a 2 QB league, I'm going to be bolstering my running back, wide receiver, tight end, and I'm going to wait on guys like Rivers or Cousins or Carr or Dak who are being drafted 50 to 80 picks after the top 5 quarterbacks are in ADP. So you can get really good guys. You're going to get quarterback ones that even though they finish as, a quarterback 14 or 15 this year, their points are only going to be just 1 or 2 points per game, possibly off of guys who finish at the low end QB1 spectrum. So yeah, you've got your top 5 or so guys that are really going to lay the points on, but anywhere from that mid QB1 all the way back through basically the end of QB2, there's only going to be a few points that separate those guys. So don't go running out there to get a quarterback super early. If you've got skill position players on the board with high upside, get those guys. Fill your roster out with those guys. Get some steady quarterbacks later on, and then just roll with that. Because honestly, there isn't going to be a ton of points that separate the entire position. Recency bias tells us Patrick Mahomes, because of last year, is going to do it again this year. I don't believe that. I think he comes down a little bit more. Jake has talked about him in some other videos and how just a few points could bring him back to earth. So just stay consistent with it this year. Let's move those quarterbacks back a little bit, focus on skill position players, and you'll do just fine. All right, so because of the big seasons from the big three tight ends last year, Kittle, Kelsey, and Ertz, we've seen people jumping really early to draft tight ends this year. But I'm here to tell you that even if you miss on those three guys, you're going to be just fine, because there's other targets in the middle rounds that you really should be focusing on. Evan Engram, OJ Howard, our boy Hunter Henry, who you've seen pop up in a couple of videos here on the show, and then Vance McDonald. All guys that I really like in 2019 to establish good tight end value, and you don't need to spend a second-round pick on them or a third-round pick like you would with Kelsey, Kittle, or Ertz. Which, Kelsey, he's a beast. I expect a really good season out of him again. But Ertz and Kittle, I see some regression coming from them. So do we really want to spend that high of a pick on them? Because these other guys might not be nearly as far off as you think. So let's throw it up here real quick. Looking at tight ends in terms of fantasy points. Now, Evan Engram and OJ Howard had some issues last year. And because of that, didn't play in nearly as many games. They had those injuries. So when we're looking in like a half PPR format and we're looking at average points per game, yeah, OJ Howard finished as the tight end 13 last year, but he only played in 10 games. His average point per game was 10.4, which actually puts him at tight end 5. And then Evan Engram, who played in 11 games last season, even though he finished as the tight end 12, he averaged 9.4 points per game, which put him at the QB or the tight end 7. So both of these guys, even though they didn't finish nearly as high when you just look at where did they finish overall for the season, you got to look at those point per games and understand that sometimes that indicator is a little bit better than just looking at overall points. Because if you do have guys that are injured and miss some times, how did they do when they were on the field and healthy? And both of those guys, because of the situations around them, could see some huge volume and some huge plays. So I'm skipping on the big three tight ends this year. Give me Engram, give me OJ Howard. I'll take a shot on Hunter Henry if I miss either of those guys, and Vance McDonald, and then we'll just go from there. Because you're going to be looking at top 5 tight end options that you can get 3 to 4 rounds later. All right, let's wrap this video up. Just a couple more things real quick. When you're wrapping up your draft, what I like to do, I completely skip on defense and special teams, and I completely skip on kickers. Why? Because even the best defensive special teams and even the best kickers are barely going to get you double-digit points in any given week. So is it really worth stashing somebody right away? Do you need to waste a draft pick? No. If you draft a little bit earlier in the offseason, focus on running back handcuffs. Even if you won't end up keeping them on your roster, focus on running back handcuffs, those deep diving guys. We just did a video a couple of days ago on some deep stashes, some running back handcuff sleepers that could end up getting some value this year. We've talked about like a Raquel Armstead. We've talked about an Alexander Madison, right? I talked about a few guys in that video. Go check it out and see what I had to say about them there. But if you spend some late round picks on those guys and stash those guys, if there's an injury in training camp, somebody's unaffected, heck, there could be a trade for all we know. Whatever ends up happening, if you end up having a guy that goes from a handcuff to a guy that all of a sudden is going to see a fair amount of volume and be a starting running back, that's always a possibility. So spend those late round picks on drafting depth for your team. And then as the preseason wears on and we get to those final couple of days before the regular season kicks off, those guys, if they don't look like they're going to do anything, toss them out of the way, throw them to the waivers, and go get one kicker on one defensive team and stream those guys. Because if you stream them, play the best matchups every week, that's a lot better than adding a couple of guys that might get you, or a team and a guy that's going to get you 20 total points for the year, or for a day, when you could be adding one guy that if he gets the right amount of volume and he breaks out, could be a lot more prosperous than that. So throw those other guys to the side. Don't worry about that. Focus on that running back depth. All right, we're wrapping this thing up. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Fantasy Headliners. Don't forget to comment. Don't forget to like the video. Definitely don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. If you are a new subscriber, let us know in the comments below. I want to welcome you to Headliner Nation personally. And don't forget that draft guide. $19.99 is going to get you one of the best values in all of fantasy football. You already saw the video. Go get your draft guide now. Check out all the videos on the channel. I'm going to catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners. Have a good one, everyone.